What's up, guys? In this video, I'm going to be taking you through my process for creating a digital landscape painting in Procreate. I'm starting this painting the way I start every painting, be it digital or traditional, and that is by covering up my canvas with this sort of a mid-tone kind of color. I usually go with this orangey brown tone because I paint a lot of landscapes with a lot of green, and that color helps those greens look more interesting, more dynamic, and less boring. Green is a knowingly difficult color to balance because it just can get overwhelmingly green and just kind of meh. So having this color to complement that, it just really helps in my experience. With that color done and with that base in place, I switch to a separate layer and start blocking in a sketch. Now, I'm not worried about this sketch being too accurate, too precise. I know that I'm not going to be following it one-to-one. I'm going to be painting over it pretty quickly. And I just wanted to be a sort of a guideline for where each element of the scene is going to be. I'm not working from reference, I'm working from imagination. I didn't do any sort of thumbnail sketches for this painting, so I'm just kind of going with the flow and just I need a rough guideline to tell me that the composition is working. So that's the whole point of that sketch. It took about 5 minutes in real time, so it was done very quickly, very roughly. And that's how I generally do my sketches. I don't take too much time doing them because, again, I know that they're gonna be gone pretty quickly. As you can see here, I'm starting to block in some color and I'm painting directly over that sketch. Now, I did make a separate layer for the color, and this is the layer that the majority of my painting is going to be painted on. The reason why I like to primarily paint on one single layer is because it sort of it forces me to work in a more traditional kind of way, which results in a more traditional kind of finished piece, with that sort of painterly kind of look, the visible brush strokes and all that. Now, sometimes I do add separate layers, and you will see me do that later on. If I want to add something that I'm not sure will work out, or if I know that it's going to be benefiting from being able to erase just that one element, then I will add a separate layer. And then once I'm done with that part of the painting, then I will blend that layer down and continue painting on one single layer again. Now, the stage I'm in right now is known as the ugly stage of the painting, which is unfortunately what the painting will look like for the majority of the process. I would say the ugly stage takes up about 70% of the process of a painting, which is kind of unfortunate. And I know it's almost got me to give up on paintings many times. It still does. The only reason why it doesn't as much anymore is because I know from experience that as long as you trust the process, as long as you keep going, 9 times out of 10, a painting will work out. Very few paintings are completely unsalvageable unless your composition is absolutely horrible and your values are terrible and you just keep going with it. Most paintings can be saved even if they don't look like they can. So I'm trusting the process and I'm just going through the steps, which right now I am at the step where I'm blocking in just big masses of color to cover up my canvas and just block in the different elements of the landscape. I'm working back to front, background to foreground. So I put in my mountains, I put in my mountain that's closer to the foreground, and now I'm finally putting in my foreground with these rocks. The one thing I'm not painting, and I will only paint at the very end, are some trees that are right behind these rocks you see right here. And the reason for that is because I know I'm gonna want to paint that mountain behind these rocks and then put those trees in. So that's why I'm saving those trees for the very end. If I were painting traditionally, I probably would have left some empty space so that I could put those trees in without affecting the paint too much. Since I'm working digitally, that's not too much of a concern, so I'm not really worried about it. Now that I have the majority of the canvas covered up in these big masses of color, I can go in and I can start adding a little bit more detail and work a little bit more on my big focal point for this piece, which is that big mountain in the distance. And that's my main subject, so I want to make sure it looks good. I want to make sure that it has a nice sort of interesting shape, that it stands out. And once I feel like I have a decent enough shape, I go in and I start putting in a little bit of more detail, some texture, some snow, some lighting. In a second, you will see me add a little bit of light. Now, at this point, I know that the sun in this scene is going to be off to the left, off frame. It's not in the scene. It's just casting light, and it's coming through these clouds that you can see in the sky. So there's going to be some spots of light hitting that mountain, whereas the majority of the painting is going to be in the shade. So that's a choice that I made because I wanted that sort of, I guess you could call it dramatic lighting, cinematic lighting. I don't know what you want to call it, but you know, I just want to have that spotty sort of light because I always love the way that looks, and I wanted to make a painting like that. So I'm bringing in some color. This is some warm rock color. You know, it's the color of the rocks being hit by that warm sunlight. And I'm putting in some shapes of snow also being hit by sunlight. This is very, very bright snow, which is going to be one of the brightest parts of the scene. Here's another example of me using a separate layer. I'm adding in some clouds, and number one, I'm not too comfortable when it comes to painting clouds like this, I'm gonna be honest. So I was afraid I was gonna mess it up, and I didn't want to have to repaint the mountain the way it is if I were to mess up those clouds. So, and I also wasn't sure I was going to leave these clouds in. It was kind of a test. I was trying to see what they would look like, and if they were gonna work out, I was gonna leave them in. And turns out they did work out. I did like the way they looked, and so I ended up leaving them in. And once I finished painting these clouds, I merged that layer down with the other main layer, and I continued painting on that one layer. Now you see me, I'm kind of like cutting into those clouds with the same brushes that I used to paint them. That's just kind of how I paint a lot of things. It's a lot of painting and erasing, or painting over, I guess. The next thing I'm doing here, which you can kind of see me do and kind of not, sorry, it's sort of cut off, but I'm just adding a curves adjustment, an S curve adjustment, which essentially just adds a little bit of contrast. I just felt like the scene was a little flat, and I just wanted it to look a little bit more punchy. So that's all I was doing there. Now with that background mostly taken care of, I move on to the foreground. So I'm adding some grass, I'm adding some texture and some detail and definition to this mountain here. And I'm also simplifying those shapes. I felt like there was a little too much going on, which was detracting from the mountain, which again is my focal point. You don't want the same level of detail and texture and definition in every part of the scene, because that's not how our eyes work. Our eyes can only focus on one thing at a time, and so you want your focal point to be the one thing that has the most detail, the most contrast, the most that jumps out the most, so that the viewer can easily tell what's the focal point and can just be drawn to it. Here's another case where I added a separate layer. I wanted to add some trees to that mid-ground. I knew that I was going to be erasing parts of those trees, and I knew it was going to be much easier to do that than to paint over them. So that's why I made a separate layer, started doodling in some of those tree shapes, and then using the same brush as an eraser, I went in and I just sort of erased them out to just, tweak those shapes a little bit, add some texture. And once again, I'm painting these the same way I do everything else. I start with a mid-tone, and then I go in with some darks, and then I go in with some even darker darks. And I'm moving towards the foreground, and this is the first time I switched brushes, by the way. I worked with one single brush throughout the painting, and now I switched to one that looked a little bit more like tree branches, because I like to work with big brushes so that I can have that sort of impressionistic, loose painterly look. And that means I don't like to go in and render every single tree branch. So using brushes that can do that for you, that can indicate and suggest shapes and texture, is very, very important when it comes to painting in this kind of style. And it'll save you a ton of time as well. Now that that midground is pretty much done, I can start focusing on the foreground. And the last few bits of this painting, this is the home stretch really, I'm about done. So I'm just refining those shapes, adding some highlights, and finally adding in those trees. As you can see, I'm covering up the majority of that mountain in the background. This is again another case of me adding in a separate layer on top of that main layer, because again, you'll see in a second, right here you see me erasing those tree shapes. I just figured it would be much easier than going in and having to paint with the same colors as that mountain in the back. So sometimes I use separate layers and then I merge them down and continue on. But this is how I paint all of my trees. This is how this is the easiest way I found to paint trees. Obviously, if you want them to be more realistic and detailed, you probably would, use a smaller brush and just really go in, zoom in real tight. But this is how I like to paint them. I start with one dark shape, go in, same brush, lighter, greener sort of color for the highlights, and then I go in and just add a little color variety to those shadows and just cut in with some sky holes. Sky holes, in my experience, are something that really, really sells the shape of a tree. I think they're very underrated. It took me years to even find out that sky holes were a thing, I'll be honest. And when I did, that it was just kind of a revelation. But that is about it. And the way I know that I'm reaching the end of a painting is when I start to work small, when I start to really chisel away at small details and I zoom in real tight. That's how I know I'm reaching the final stages of a painting. And in this case, for this painting, the final stage is to add an overlay layer to just sort of paint in some nice lighting. This is not something I always do, but the mountain in the back, I felt like it could really use a little bit more of a punchy, more like warmer sort of lighting. So I just brought in an overlay layer on a semi-low opacity. I think it was about 30-40%, and I just painted in some extra color and warmth. So that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it shed some light, no pun intended, into my process. And if you have any questions for me, if you want me to explain any of my process further, feel free to ask comments down below, and I'll be around to answer them. Thank you guys so much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.